The year is 1986. America is feeling pretty good about itself. The Space Shuttle, the world's first reusable spacecraft, is basically a national celebrity. It was sold to the public as a kind of spacefaring semi-truck, making trips to orbit routine, cheap, and safe. Spoiler alert, it was none of those things. This particular mission, STS-51L, was extra special. It had Krista McAuliffe on board, the first teacher in space, meant to prove that space was for everyone. A lovely piece of public relations that distracted from the fact that the shuttle was an incredibly complex, experimental vehicle that had a habit of trying to kill its occupants. What followed wasn't a tragic, unpredictable accident. It was the predictable, almost inevitable result of a system where PowerPoints mattered more than physics. To understand why Challenger exploded, you need to understand the solid rocket boosters, or SRBs. These were the two big white rockets strapped to the side of the main fuel tank. They provided most of the liftoff thrust and were, essentially, giant, controlled explosions. Because they were so massive, they had to be built in segments and shipped by train to Florida. This meant they had joints. And to stop 3,000-degree gas from torching its way through those joints, engineers at a company called Morton Thiokol used O-rings. 2 of them per joint. Basically, very expensive, very important rubber bands designed to seal the gap. There was just one tiny, insignificant little problem they'd known about for years. Rubber gets stiff when it's cold. And if a rubber seal gets stiff, it doesn't seal, which is generally considered a bad thing when you're dealing with, a rocket. By 1986, NASA was a victim of its own success. The pressure to launch frequently was immense. They were trying to run a space program like an airline, with tight schedules and demanding clients. The Challenger launch had already been delayed several times, and the PR department was getting antsy. More importantly, President Ronald Reagan was scheduled to give his State of the Union address that very night, and he planned to mention the teacher in space. A successful launch was a crucial political talking point. This created a powerful, unspoken pressure known as go fever. It's a delightful condition where the desire to launch something overrides the mountain of evidence suggesting that maybe, just maybe, you should wait. It's a phenomenon where very smart people collectively decide that hoping for the best is a valid engineering strategy. This brings us to the evening of January 27th, the night before the launch. The forecast was for temperatures to drop into the 20s Fahrenheit, far colder than any previous launch. The engineers at Morton Thiokol, the people who actually built the boosters, were panicking. They arranged an emergency teleconference with NASA managers. An engineer named Roger Boisjoli, a man who deserves to be more famous, presented 13 charts showing why launching in the cold was a catastrophically bad idea. He methodically demonstrated that in colder weather, the O-rings were slow to seal and showed more damage. He wasn't saying it might be a problem, he was screaming, in the most professional engineering speak possible, that if they launched, the shuttle would probably explode. He ended his presentation by stating the temperature for the next day was away from the database, a polite way of saying we are flying into the unknown, and the unknown has teeth. The data was clear. The coldest launch to date had been at 53 degrees Fahrenheit, and it had resulted in the worst O-ring erosion ever seen. The forecast for the next morning was 31 degrees. You don't need a PhD in thermodynamics to spot the trend. But NASA managers, specifically a man named Larry Malloy, were not impressed. They looked at the same data and decided it was inconclusive. They argued that since some launches in warmer weather also had some O-ring damage, there was no clear pattern. This is a masterclass in motivated reasoning. It's like saying that since you can get a sunburn on a cloudy day, sunscreen is useless on a sunny day. The engineers were arguing from physics. The managers were arguing from a deadline. Physics, it turns out, does not care about your schedule. Frustrated by the engineers' refusal to give their approval, NASA's George Hardy famously said he was appalled by their recommendation not to launch. Larry Malloy then delivered the line that sealed Challenger's fate, asking scornfully, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April?" The pressure was immense. NASA was the only customer. So Thiokol's senior vice president, Jerry Mason, turned to his chief engineer, Bob Lund, and said, "Take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat." In that one sentence, the entire disaster is crystallized. It was a direct order to stop thinking about physical reality and start thinking about customer satisfaction and contractual obligations. Thiokol's managers then overruled their own engineers and officially recommended to launch. A decision was made, not based on data or safety, but on a desire to not annoy the people in charge. The morning of January 28, 1986 was brutally cold at Cape Canaveral. There were literally icicles hanging off the launch tower. Alan McDonald, Thiokol's man on site, refused to sign the launch recommendation, telling his NASA counterpart, "If anything happens to this launch, I wouldn't want to be the person that has to stand in front of a board of inquiry to explain why." A profit, it turns out. They launched anyway. At 0.678 seconds after ignition, a puff of black smoke appeared near the aft field joint of the right SRB. It was the O-rings, too cold and stiff to seal the joint. Hot gas was already leaking. For the next minute, the shuttle flew a seemingly perfect ascent. But inside the joint, the inferno was growing. At 73 seconds, the external fuel tank was breached, it ruptured, and the Space Shuttle Challenger was torn apart in a cloud of fire and smoke, 46,000 feet above the Atlantic. In the aftermath, President Reagan formed the Rogers Commission to investigate what went wrong. It was mostly a collection of officials and astronauts, designed for a smooth, official report. But crucially, it also included Richard Feynman, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist and world-class curmudgeon who had no patience for bureaucracy. While the other commissioners listened to sanitized testimony, Feynman did his own detective work. His big moment came during a televised public hearing. He got a C-clamp, a small piece of O-ring material, and a glass of ice water. He clamped the rubber, dunked it in the water for a few minutes, then took it out and released the clamp. The rubber didn't spring back. It stayed compressed. In 2 minutes, with hardware store supplies, he demonstrated the entire physical cause of the disaster for the whole world to see, completely short-circuiting NASA's carefully managed narrative. Feynman's stunt revealed the technical flaw, but the Commission's final report identified the real cause, a broken safety culture at NASA. Sociologist Diane Vaughan later gave this phenomenon a name, the normalization of deviance. Every time they flew with a little O-ring damage and the shuttle didn't explode, they unconsciously lowered their safety standards. The abnormal became the new acceptable normal. They redefined risk to fit their schedule. It wasn't one bad decision on one cold night. It was 1,000 tiny compromises that eroded the margin of safety until there was none left. It's a chillingly human story. We ignore small warnings, we get away with it, and we convince ourselves the warnings don't matter. Until, one day, they do. The saddest part is that 17 years later, the shuttle Columbia was lost due to the same organizational failures, proving that the hardest part of learning from history is actually learning from history. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!